Hi everyone. Today we'll be discussing the American experience during the years of what we call the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, typically referred to during the period as the two superpowers. The U.S. emerged from World War II as the world's leading power. It alone possessed the atomic bomb. The only power that in any way could rival the United States was the Soviet Union, whose armies now occupied most of Eastern Europe. Looking backward, it appears inevitable that the two major powers to emerge from the war would come into conflict. Born of a common foe rather than common long-term interests, values, or history, the wartime alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union began to unravel almost from the day that peace was declared. Early in 1946, in his famous long telegram from Moscow, the American diplomat George Kennan, who we see here in our first image, advised the Truman administration that the Soviets could not be dealt with as a normal government. Communist ideology drove them to try to expand their power throughout the world, he claimed, and only the United States had the ability to stop them. Kennan's telegram laid the foundation for what became known as the policy of containment, according to which the U.S. committed itself to preventing any further expansion of Soviet power. Shortly afterward, in a speech at Fulton, Missouri, from which we have an image here, Britain's former wartime Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, declared that an iron curtain had descended across Europe, partitioning the free West from the communist East. It would not be until March 1947, in an address announcing what came to be known as the Truman Doctrine, that the president officially embraced the Cold War as the foundation of American foreign policy and started to describe it as a worldwide struggle over the future of freedom. As the leader of the so-called free world, Truman said the United States now had to shoulder the responsibility of supporting what he called freedom-loving peoples, wherever communism threatened them. Truman succeeded in persuading both Republicans and Democrats in Congress to support his policy of containment, beginning a long period of bipartisan support for the Cold War. As Truman's speech to Congress suggested, the contest was in part an ideological conflict. Both sides claimed to be promoting freedom and social justice while defending their own security, and each offered its social system as a model that the rest of the world should follow. Truman's rhetoric suggested that the U.S. had assumed a permanent global responsibility. The speech set a precedent for American assistance to anti-communist regimes throughout the world, no matter how undemocratic, and for the creation of a set of global military alliances directed against the Soviet Union. There soon followed the creation of new national security bodies, immune from democratic oversight, such as the Atomic Energy Commission, the National Security Council, and the Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA, set up in 1947 to gather intelligence and conduct secret military operations abroad. The threat of American military action overseas formed only one pillar of containment. Truman's Secretary of State, George C. Marshall, spelled out the other in a speech at Harvard University in June 1947. Here we see Marshall standing to the left of President Truman. Marshall pledged the United States to contribute billions of dollars to finance the economic recovery of Europe. The Marshall Plan, as it came to be known, offered a positive vision to go along with containment. The program proved to be one of the most successful foreign aid efforts in history. By 1950, Western European production exceeded pre-war levels, and the region was poised to follow the U.S. down the road to becoming a mass consumer society. Because the Soviet Union refused to participate, fearing American control over the economies of Eastern Europe, the Marshall Plan further solidified the division of the continent between a capitalist West and a communist East. Under the guidance of General Douglas MacArthur, captured in this photograph, Japan adopted a new democratic constitution. Thanks to American insistence and against the wishes of most Japanese leaders, the new constitution gave women the right to vote for the first time in Japan's history. Furthermore, Article 9 of the new charter stated that Japan would renounce forever the policy of war and armed aggression, maintaining only a modest self-defense force. The United States also oversaw the economic reconstruction of Japan. Initially, the U.S. proposed to dissolve Japan's giant industrial corporations, which had contributed so much to the nation's war effort. But this plan was abandoned in 1948 in favor of an effort to rebuild Japan's industrial base as a bastion of anti-communist strength in Asia. By the 1950s, thanks to American economic assistance, the adoption of new technologies and low spending on the military, Japan's economic recovery was in full swing. Meanwhile, the Cold War intensified, and despite the Marshall Plan, increasingly took a militaristic turn. At the end of World War II, each of the four victorious powers assumed control over a section of occupied Germany and of Berlin, the capital, located deep in the Soviet zone. We can see the organization of the arrangement on this map. Soon, two new nations emerged, East and West Germany, each allied with a side in the Cold War. Berlin itself remained divided. It wouldn't be until 1991 that Germany would be reunified. Also, in 1949, the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb, ending American monopoly over the weapon. That same year, the United States, Canada, and 10 Western European nations established the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, as it's better known, pledging mutual defense against any future Soviet attack. Soon, West Germany became a crucial part of NATO. The Soviets formalized their own Eastern European alliance, known as the Warsaw Pact, to counter NATO in 1955. In October 1949, communists led by Mao Zedong, captured in this image, emerged victorious after a long Chinese civil war. This was a serious setback for the American policy of containment. Assailed by Republicans for having lost China, which of course the U.S. never had in the first place, the Truman administration refused to recognize the new government, the People's Republic of China, and it moved to block it from occupying China's seat on the Security Council at the United Nations. All the way up to the 1970s, the U.S. insisted that the ousted regime, which had been forced into exile on the island of Taiwan, remained the legitimate government of China. In the wake of Soviet-American confrontations in Europe, the communist victory in China, and Soviet success in developing the atomic bomb, the National Security Council approved a call for a permanent military buildup, one that would enable the United States to pursue a global crusade against communism. Known as NSC 68, this 1950 manifesto, which we can see the front page of here, described the Cold War as an epic struggle between the idea of freedom and the idea of slavery under the grim oligarchy of the Kremlin. Initially, American post-war policy focused on Europe, but it was in Asia that the Cold War ultimately turned hot. Occupied by Japan during World War II, Korea had been divided in 1945 into Soviet and American zones. These zones soon evolved into two governments, Communist North Korea and anti-communist South Korea, undemocratic but aligned with the United States. In June 1950, the North Korean army invaded the South, hoping to reunify the country under communist control. North Korean soldiers soon occupied most of the peninsula. Here we see an image of South Koreans attempting to flee from the invasion. The Truman administration, in response to the attack, persuaded the UN Security Council to authorize the use of force to repel the invasion. The Soviet Union, which could have vetoed the resolution, was at the time boycotting Security Council meetings in protest over the refusal to seat Communist China within the body. American troops did the bulk of the fighting on this first battlefield of the Cold War. In September 1950, General Douglas MacArthur launched a counterattack at Incheon, behind North Korean lines. Here we have a couple of images from the U.S. invasion and assault at Incheon. MacArthur's army soon occupied most of North Korea. Truman, at this point, was hoping he could unite Korea under a pro-American government. But in October 1950, when UN forces neared the Chinese border, hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops intervened, driving them back in bloody fighting. Here we see some of the Chinese troops crossing the Yalu River on their way to the encounter. MacArthur demanded the right to push north again, or possibly invade China, even threatening the use of nuclear weapons against it. But Truman, fearing an all-out war on the Asian mainland, refused. The war then settled into a stalemate around the 38th parallel, the original boundary between the two Koreas. Not until 1953 was an armistice agreed to, essentially restoring the pre-war status quo. There has never been a formal peace treaty ending the Korean War. More than 33,000 Americans died in Korea. The Asian death toll reached an estimated 1 million Korean soldiers and 2 million civilians, along with hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops. Korea made it clear that the Cold War, which began in Europe, had become a global conflict. As not a few contemporary critics, few of them sympathetic to Soviet communism, pointed out at the time of the Korean War, casting the Cold War in terms of a worldwide battle between freedom and slavery had unfortunate consequences. In a penetrating critique of Truman's policies, Walter Lippmann, who we have in this photograph, one of the country's most prominent journalists, objected to turning foreign policy into what he called an ideological crusade. To view every challenge to the status quo as part of a contest with the Soviet Union, Lippmann correctly predicted, would require the U.S. to recruit and subsidize an array of satellites, clients, dependents, and puppet states. It would have to intervene continuously in the affairs of nations whose political problems did not arise from Moscow and could not be easily understood in terms of the battle between freedom and slavery, espoused in the Truman Doctrine of foreign policy. World War II had increased American awareness of the problem of imperialism. Many movements for colonial independence borrowed the language of the American Declaration of Independence in demanding the right to self-government. Liberal Democrats and black leaders urged the Truman administration to take the lead in promoting worldwide decolonization, insisting that a free world worthy of the name should not include colonies or empires. But as the Cold War developed, the United States backed away from pressuring its European allies to grant self-government to colonies like French Indochina, the Dutch East Indies, and British possessions like the Gold Coast and Nigeria in Africa, and Malaya in Asia. No matter how repressive to its own people, if a nation joined the worldwide anti-communist alliance led by the United States, it was counted as a member of the free world. The Republic of South Africa, for example, was considered as a part of the free world, even though its white majority had deprived the black population there of nearly all their rights under apartheid. Among other things, the Cold War was an ideological struggle, a battle, in a popular phrase of the 1950s, for the hearts and minds of people throughout the world. During the 1950s, freedom became an inescapable theme of academic research, popular journalism, mass culture, and official pronouncements. One of the more unusual Cold War battlefields involved American history and culture. National security agencies encouraged Hollywood to produce anti-communist movies, such as 1949's The Red Menace and 1950's I Married a Communist, and urged that film scripts be changed, I should say, to remove references to less than praiseworthy aspects of American history, such as Indian removal, slavery, and racial discrimination. Here we have the movie posters for The Red Menace. And I Married a Communist. Along with freedom, the Cold War's other great mobilizing concept was totalitarianism. The term originated in Europe between the world wars to describe fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, aggressive, ideologically driven states that sought to subdue all of civil society, including churches, unions, and other voluntary associations, to their control. By the 1950s, the term had become shorthand for describing those on the Soviet side in the Cold War. Just as the conflict over slavery redefined American freedom in the 19th century, and the confrontation with the Nazis shaped understandings of freedom during World War II, the Cold War reshaped them once again. Whatever Moscow stood for was, by definition, the opposite of freedom, including anything to which the word socialized could be attached. In the largest public relations campaign in American history up to that time, the American Medical Association raised the specter of socialized medicine to defeat Truman's proposal for national health insurance. The Cold War also affected the emerging concept of human rights. The idea that there are rights that are applicable to all of humanity originated during the 18th century in the Enlightenment and the American and French revolutions. The atrocities committed during World War II, as well as the global language of the Four Freedoms, forcefully raised the issue of human rights in the post-war world. After the war, the victorious Allies put numerous German officials on trial before special courts at Nuremberg for crimes against humanity. For the first time, individuals were held directly accountable to the international community for violations of human rights. The trials resulted in prison terms for many Nazi officials and the execution of 10 leaders. In 1948, the UN General Assembly approved the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, drafted by a committee chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt, seen here holding up a French copy of the charter. It identified a broad range of rights to be enjoyed by people everywhere, including freedom of speech, religious toleration, and protection against arbitrary government, as well as social and economic entitlements like the right to an adequate standard of living and access to housing, education, and medical care. Here we see the UN gathering in Paris that officially approved the document. The problem was that it had no enforcement mechanism. Some considered it an exercise in empty rhetoric. But the core principle that a nation's treatment of its own citizens should be subject to outside evaluation slowly became part of the language in which freedom was discussed. One reason for the lack of an enforcement mechanism in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was that both the United States and the Soviet Union refused to accept outside interference in their internal affairs or restraints on their ability to conduct foreign policy as they desired. In 1947, the NAACP did file a petition with the UN asking it to investigate racism in the United States as a violation of human rights, but the UN decided that it lacked jurisdiction. Nonetheless, since the end of World War II, the enjoyment of human rights has increasingly taken its place in definitions of freedom across the globe, especially in places where such rights are flagrantly violated. With the end of World War II, President Truman's first domestic task was to preside over the transition from a wartime to a peacetime economy. The government abolished wartime agencies that regulated industrial production and labor relations, and it dismantled wartime price controls, leading to a sharp rise in prices. Truman's program, which he announced in September 1945 and would later call the Fair Deal, focused on improving the social safety net and raising the standard of living of ordinary Americans. He called on Congress to increase the minimum wage, enact a program of national health insurance, and expand public housing, Social Security, and aid to education. Backed by organized labor and party liberals, Truman really hoped to revive the stalled momentum of the New Deal. In 1946, a new wave of labor militancy swept the country when both the AFL and the CIO launched what became known as Operation Dixie, a campaign to bring unionization to the South and, by so doing, shatter the hold of anti-labor conservatives on the region's politics. Here we have an image from one of the Operation Dixie walkouts in North Carolina. And one of a CIO headquarters sign in the Tar Heel state from the time. As inflation soared following the removal of price controls, the resulting drop in workers' real income sparked the largest strike wave in American history. Nearly 5 million workers, including those in the steel, auto, coal, and other key industries, walked off their jobs, demanding wage increases. In the midterm congressional elections of 1946, large numbers of middle-class voters, alarmed by the labor turmoil, voted Republican. For the first time since the 1920s, Republicans swept to control of both houses of Congress. Meanwhile, in the face of vigorous opposition from Southern employers and public officials, and the reluctance of many white workers to join interracial labor unions, Operation Dixie had failed to unionize the South or even to dent the political control of conservative Democrats in the region. The election of 1946 ensured that a conservative coalition of Republicans and Southern Democrats would continue to dominate Congress. They proceeded to turn aside Truman's Fair Deal program. Instead, Congress enacted tax cuts for wealthy Americans and, over the president's veto in 1947, passed what was known as the Taft-Hartley Act, which sought to reverse the gains made by organized labor over the past decade. The measure authorized the president to suspend strikes by ordering an 80-day so-called cooling-off period. Congress also outlawed the closed shop, which required a worker to be a union member when taking up a job, and authorized states to pass what were known as right-to-work laws, prohibiting other forms of compulsory union membership. It forced union officials to swear that they were not communists. Over time, as population and capital investment shifted to states with these right-to-work laws, like Texas, Florida, and North Carolina, the Taft-Hartley Act contributed to the decline of organized labor's share of the nation's workforce, which of course was the whole idea of the legislation in the first place. During his first term, Truman reached out in unprecedented ways to the nation's black community. In October 1947, a commission on civil rights, appointed by the president, issued a document entitled "To Secure These Rights," one of the most devastating indictments ever published of racial inequality in America. We see the front page of the document here in this image. It called on the federal government to assume the responsibility for abolishing segregation and ensuring equal treatment in housing, employment, education, and the criminal justice system. In February 1948, Truman presented an ambitious civil rights program to Congress, calling for a permanent federal civil rights commission, national laws against lynching and the poll tax, and action to ensure equal access to jobs and education. Congress, as the president anticipated, approved none of his proposals. But in July 1948, just as the presidential campaign was getting underway, Truman issued an executive order desegregating the armed forces. The armed services became the first large institution in American life to promote racial integration actively and to attempt to root out long-standing racist practices. The Democratic Party platform of 1948 was the most progressive in the party's history. Led by Hubert Humphrey, the young mayor of Minneapolis, Minnesota at the time, party liberals overcame Southern resistance and added a strong civil rights plank to the platform. Here in this photograph, we see Humphrey addressing the Democratic National Convention that year. At the close of his speech, numerous Southern delegates, dubbed Dixiecrats by the press, walked out. Here we see some of the Mississippi delegation exiting the Philadelphia Convention Hall at the time. The disgruntled Southerners soon formed what they called the States' Rights Democratic Party and nominated their own candidate for president, the governor of South Carolina at the time, Strom Thurmond, captured in this photo. The Dixiecrat platform called for the complete segregation of the races, and their campaign drew most of its support from those alarmed by Truman's civil rights initiatives. Also in 1948, a group of the president's left-wing critics, particularly critical of his foreign policy, formed the Progressive Party, not to be equated with the progressives of the early 20th century, and nominated the former vice president under FDR, Henry Wallace, for president, who we have here in this image. Wallace advocated an expansion of social welfare programs at home and denounced racial segregation even more vigorously than Truman. Here we see him in another photo taken on the campaign trail in 1948. When he traveled through the South, angry white crowds attacked him, but his real difference with Truman concerned the Cold War. Wallace called for international control of nuclear weapons and a renewed effort to develop a relationship with the Soviet Union based on economic cooperation rather than military confrontation. Wallace threatened to draw votes from Truman on the left and Thurmond and the Dixiecrats to undermine the president's support in the South, where whites had voted solidly Democratic throughout the 20th century. But Truman's main opponent on the Republican side was the colorless Thomas A. Dewey, captured again here in this photo. Certain of victory and an ineffective campaigner and speaker, Dewey appeared unwilling to commit himself on controversial issues, where Truman, by contrast, ran an aggressive election campaign. The president crisscrossed the country by train, delivering fiery attacks on what he called the do-nothing Congress. Virtually every public opinion poll and newspaper report predicted a Dewey victory. Truman's ultimate success, 303 to 189 electoral votes, represented one of the greatest upsets in American political history. Here we see the president holding up the famously incorrect headlines of a Dewey win in the contest. Thurmond carried 4 Deep South states, demonstrating that the race issue, couched in terms of so-called individual freedom, had the potential to lead traditionally Democratic white voters to desert their party. In retrospect, the states' rights campaign of the Dixiecrats in 1948 offered a preview of the political transformation that by the end of the 20th century would leave every Southern state in the Republican column, much as it is today. As for Henry Wallace, he suffered the humiliation of polling fewer popular votes than Thurmond. For nearly half a century, the Cold War profoundly affected American life. There would be no return to normalcy as after the First World War. The military-industrial establishment created during World War II would become permanent, not temporary. National security became the stated reason for a host of government projects. The Cold War encouraged a culture of secrecy and dishonesty. American nuclear tests, conducted on Pacific Islands and in Nevada, exposed thousands of civilians to radiation that caused cancer and birth defects. Cold War military spending helped to fuel economic growth and support scientific research that not only perfected weaponry, but also led to things like improved aircraft, computers, medicines, and other products with a large impact on civilian life. The international embarrassment caused by American racial policies began to lead toward the dismantling of Jim Crow segregation. And like other wars, the Cold War encouraged the drawing of a sharp line between patriotic Americans and those accused of being disloyal. At precisely the moment when the United States celebrated freedom as the foundation of American life, the right to dissent came under attack. Dividing the world between liberty and slavery automatically made those who could be linked to communism enemies of freedom. Although the assault on civil liberties came to be known as McCarthyism, it began before Senator Joseph R. McCarthy of Wisconsin burst onto the national scene in 1950. In 1947, less than 2 weeks after announcing the Truman Doctrine, the president established a loyalty review system in which government employees were required to demonstrate their patriotism without being allowed to confront accusers or, in some cases, even to know the charges against them. Along with persons suspected of disloyalty, the new national security system also targeted homosexuals who worked for the government. They were deemed particularly susceptible to blackmail by Soviet agents, as well as supposedly lacking the manly qualities needed to maintain the country's resolve in the fight against communism. Truman's loyalty program failed to uncover any cases of espionage, but several hundred people were still dismissed from their government jobs. Also in 1947, what was known as the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC, in Congress, launched a series of hearings about communist influence in Hollywood, calling well-known screenwriters, directors, and actors to appear before the committee ensured a wave of national publicity, which the committee members relished. Celebrities like the producer, Walt Disney, and famous actors like Ronald Reagan and Gary Cooper testified that the movie industry harbored numerous communists. Here we see Gary Cooper in his appearance before the committee, smiling on the far left of the photograph. But as it turned out, 10 so-called unfriendly witnesses refused to answer the committee's questions about their political beliefs or to name names, identify individual communists, on the grounds that the hearings violated the First Amendment's guarantees of freedom of speech and political association. The committee charged the Hollywood 10, as they came to be known, with contempt of Congress, including, as we see here, two of the biggest screenwriters in the industry, Ring Lardner Jr., who we see here in this image, and probably even more famous at the time in this photo, Dalton Trumbo. Almost all of them, the Hollywood 10, served jail terms of 6 months to a year and were blacklisted by Hollywood studios. That is, they were denied work, along with more than 200 others who were accused of communist sympathies or who refused to name names. A series of highly publicized legal cases followed, which fueled the growing anti-communist hysteria. Whittaker Chambers, captured in this photograph, an editor at Time magazine, testified before the House Un-American Activities Committee that during the 1930s, Alger Hiss, a high-ranking State Department official, had given him secret government documents to pass to agents of the Soviet Union. Hiss, seen here, vehemently denied the charge, but a jury convicted him of perjury, and he served 5 years in prison. A young congressman from California and a member of the HUAC committee, Richard Nixon, who we see here, achieved national prominence because of his dogged pursuit of Hiss. The most sensational trial of the time involved Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, captured in this photo, a working-class Jewish communist couple from New York City. In 1951, a jury convicted the Rosenbergs of conspiracy to pass secrets concerning the atomic bomb to Soviet agents during World War II. The case against Julius Rosenberg rested on highly secret documents that could not be revealed in court. The government had almost no evidence against Ethel Rosenberg. But in the atmosphere of hysteria, their convictions were certain. Despite an international outcry, both were executed in 1953. Here's the New York Times front page that covered the event. In this climate, a little-known senator from Wisconsin suddenly emerged as the chief national pursuer of subversives and gave a new name to the anti-communist crusade. Seen here in this photograph, Joseph R. McCarthy had won election to the Senate in 1946, partly on the basis of a fictional war record he falsely claimed to have flown combat missions in the Pacific during World War II. In a speech at Wheeling, West Virginia, in February 1950, McCarthy announced that he had a list of 205 communists working for the State Department. The charge was preposterous. The numbers constantly changed, and McCarthy never identified a single person guilty of genuine disloyalty. But with a genius for self-promotion, he used the Senate subcommittee he chaired to hold hearings and level wild charges against numerous individuals, as well as the Defense Department, Voice of America Radio, and other government agencies. McCarthy's downfall came in 1954 when a Senate committee investigated his charges that the Army had harbored and coddled communists. The nationally televised Army McCarthy hearings, as they came to be known, revealed the senator as a bully who browbeat witnesses and made sweeping accusations with no basis in fact. Here we have an image from the hearings. The dramatic high point came when McCarthy attacked the loyalty of a young lawyer and the firm of Joseph Welch, the Army's chief attorney. "Let us not assassinate this lad further," Welch pleaded. "You've done enough," he told McCarthy and the nation that was watching. "Have you no sense of decency, sir?" After the hearings ended, the Republican-controlled Senate voted to condemn McCarthy for his behavior. But the word, McCarthyism, had entered the political vocabulary, a shorthand for character assassination, guilt by association, and abuse of power in the name of anti-communism. Individual states in the late 1940s and 1950s created their own committees, modeled on HUAC, that investigated suspected communists and other dissenters. Many localities required loyalty oaths of teachers, pharmacists, and members of other professions. Throughout the country, those who failed to testify about their past and present political beliefs and to inform on possible communists lost their jobs. Universities refused to allow left-wing speakers to appear on campus and fired teachers who refused to sign loyalty oaths or to testify against others. There undoubtedly were Soviet spies in the United States, Yet the tiny U.S. Communist Party hardly posed a threat to American security. Moreover, the vast majority of those jailed or deprived of their livelihoods during the McCarthy era were guilty of nothing more than holding unpopular beliefs and engaging in lawful political activities. Government agencies like the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, used anti-communism to expand its power. Under its longtime director, seen in this image, J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI developed files on thousands of American citizens, including political dissenters, homosexuals, and others, most of whom had no connection to communism. For business, anti-communism became part of a campaign to identify labor unions and government intervention in the economy with socialism. White supremacists employed anti-communism as a weapon against black civil rights. At its height, from the late 1940s to around 1960, the anti-communist crusade powerfully structured American politics and culture. The fear of aliens sparked by the anti-communist crusade, however, went far beyond communism. In 1954, the federal government launched what's known as Operation Wetback, which employed the military to invade Mexican-American neighborhoods and round up and deport so-called illegal aliens. Here we have a couple of images from the time. The first showing groups of Mexicans caught up in the raids, waiting for deportation. And the second demonstrating the treatment they received. People thrown into the backs of caged trucks, driven to the border, and dumped. Within a year, some 1 million Mexicans had been deported. Finally, the civil rights movement also underwent a transformation in the period. Although a few prominent black leaders, most notably the singer and actor Paul Robeson and the veteran activist and scholar W.E.B. Du Bois, seen here together in our last image, became outspoken critics of the Cold War. Most people felt they had no choice but to go along with the government. The NAACP, for example, purged communists from local branches. Black organizations embraced the language of the Cold War and tried to use it for their own purposes. They insisted that by damaging the American image abroad, racial inequality played into the Russians' hands. As a result, they helped to cement Cold War ideology as the foundation of the political culture, while complicating the idea of American freedom. President Truman had called for greater attention to civil rights, in part to improve the American image abroad. All in all, however, the height of the Cold War was an unfavorable time to raise questions about the imperfections of American society. By 1948, the Truman administration's civil rights flurry had subsided. Okay, so that does it for our discussion of the Cold War. Next time we'll look at the cultural and economic phenomenon that was the U.S. in the 1950s and the rise of what scholars call an affluent society.